I'm Nitin Gokhale, and with me is Wilson Beaver, policy analyst on defense with the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., visiting India for the Raisina dialogue and other, of course, other meetings. But somebody who watches the defense space in the United States and its readiness to fight different wars in different theaters, and somebody who's also watching the Russia-Ukraine conflict for the past couple of years. So we thought it's a good time to ask him, how does US look at what's happening in these theaters, and what should US be doing ideally? So welcome to this program, Wilson.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let me start with your papers that you have recently written about the US capability or US manufacturing capability for war stores and ammunition and otherwise. And given the fact that US is now involved, I mean, it always has been, but now particularly so in at least three main theaters. The Red Sea, of course, is the latest one, but this is Ukraine, which is its backing, and it's got the Indo-Pacific or Taiwan specifically. What do you think the US is thinking in terms of prioritizing these theaters?
For sure. Well, a lot of the problems we're facing now stem from the fact that we haven't been engaged in large-scale production of these sorts of munitions really since the 80s. A lot of the stuff currently being expended is actually the end of the Cold War's munition stockpiles. In the 80s, GDP, defense spending was around 6 or 7% of GDP. Earlier in the 70s and the 60s, it was even higher, around 10%. Since the end of the Cold War, it's been around 3%. So the United States has just as many responsibilities as it did when it was spending 10% of GDP.
Or maybe increased responsibilities.
Increased even, yeah. So we're engaged in, on every continent. People are calling for us to take seriously the threats from Iran, Russia, and China simultaneously. And honestly, the US military is stretched thin. It's having a hard time dealing with all three threats simultaneously. And there's a very active debate in Washington right now about where we should be prioritizing. If we can do everything, or if we should have primary and secondary theaters that we should be focused on. I'm a conservative. I work at a conservative think tank. And our general consensus is that China should be considered the primary challenge to the United States, and that the US has to rebalance towards the Pacific.
So Taiwan obviously is the main priority in that Pacific, if you really look at for US, and that's obviously a conclusion that you've come after studying the entire global scenario. But it looks like US is giving a lot of attention to Ukraine, in Europe, in fact.
For sure.
And President Trump, in his constant ranting, if you want to call that, or his opinions, he's been saying that NATO must do its own stuff and not depend on the US. How does one see the future panning out? Is the Russia-Ukraine war going to drag on? How do you see as a policy analyst?
Well, firstly, absolutely, NATO needs to do a lot more. The rest of NATO, I should say. The United States is by far the largest military donor to Ukraine. If you count up the donations of all of the European Union in military aid, it's less than what the United States has given, despite being relatively comparable in GDP with us. Russia, I think, is manageable from a European perspective. It really is. Their GDP is less than France alone. If the Europeans want to deter Russia, I think they can.
On their own?
On their own.
Right.
I mean, the United States is going to stay in NATO, and we're perfectly happy to help provide the strategic umbrella, things like that, and I don't think we should abandon Europe. But we really need to focus elsewhere. And our most recent supplemental, $60 billion for Ukraine aid, and about $5 billion for everything in the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't match our strategy or our priorities.
Exactly. I think the intent is something else, and I think the reality is something else as we see it, as it's panning out right now. When you say that US must focus more on the Indo-Pacific, or at least on the Pacific vis-a-vis China, there is also this danger of Russia and China doing a handshake, which they already have, maybe a tighter embrace. So there is another school of thought elsewhere, non-US school of thought, that Russia and China have entrapped US in a war that they need not really fight. Is that something that you have looked at?
I definitely think that if our involvement in Ukraine continues, then that you can certainly make that case that if the United States spends another $60 billion, increases presidential drawdown authority, which is the president can just pull out existing munitions and equipment from big units and warehouses and send it straight to Ukraine. If we keep doing that, then yes, I think if something were to happen elsewhere 1 or 2 or 3 years from now, we won't have had time to replenish all the munitions we've already sent to Ukraine. There's a serious imbalance, and as you said, it's happening everywhere. So the United States, our engagement in the Red Sea, right? The rockets, the drones and rockets that the Houthis are sending at ships are really cheap to make. Some of the sort of Scud-like missiles will be about $50,000.
Right.
The drones are only about $2,000.
Exactly.
And an American ship will shoot them down with a $2 million rocket. So it's not sustainable.
Sure.
And in terms of our munitions production, last year we built 70 cruise missiles.
Yeah.
In the attacks, the U.S. strikes on Yemen last month, we fired 50 cruise missiles.
Left with 20 alone.
Right.
I mean, in existing, maybe there are other numbers.
There's more existing.
More existing, but if you're not replenishing it in large numbers,
For
then
sure.
it's going to be a... What about ammunition itself? Is U.S. capable of ramping up ammunition production? Because 155 mm seems to be in great demand in Ukraine, and it might even be in great demand in other theaters going forward. Because one of the observations that we have in India is that the European countries or the NATO countries have actually degraded their production capacities, manufacturing capacities as far as defense ammunition, I mean military ammunition is concerned. And if that be so, where is the ammunition going to come from for the Ukraine sustenance against Russia? Is the US going to be in a tight spot then?
So we are ramping up 155 production. As a prioritizer for the Indo-Pacific, I don't think it has a ton of relevance to a Taiwan contingency, for example. And as we increase our spending on 155, it's kind of a opportunity loss for LRASMs, JASMs, all the precision-guided munitions that would be more relevant in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
But you're right. There is a difficulty in ramping up the production of any munitions in Europe and the United States at this point. In my opinion, mostly because of the de-industrialization that has happened since the 90s.
That's right.
You can't really have a defense industrial base without an industrial base.
Sure.
And we all talk about the way, when World War II started, America was mostly making refrigerators and cars. But within a year, all these factories had been switched over to making bombers and tanks and munitions. We can't do that now. We don't have enough factories making normal things.
Because the factories have moved to China.
They're all in China, right? Or, we're friend-shoring now, so they're going to Malaysia or Mexico, which is much better. But still hard to build any defense articles abroad.
Sure. So that's going to be a major dilemma as far as the US is concerned, and it's a concerning issue really, because after all, United States has played the role of being the big power, wielding the stick wherever required. Now, if that be the case, do you think as a policy analyst, are you watching that space where China is slowly building its own capability and capacity and storing ammunition, which would be useful in any conflict, even in the Indo-Pacific, leave alone any other theater?
Absolutely. They've been laser focused on relevant capabilities. They've been shifting funding, defense spending from the personnel bucket into the equipment procurement bucket of weapons and equipment. They have been engaged in a large buildup of standoff missiles that would be very relevant to the theater. So ground-based standoff missiles, most of them, the intermediate range ones, were banned between Russia and the United States in the INF Treaty, which expired in 2019. So the U.S. is building some now, but the Chinese never signed this treaty, so they've been building them for decades.
Absolutely.
So there's a huge catch-up game there.
So the US catch-up game there. And Taiwan doesn't seem to be stabilizing the situation there. The Chinese aggression continues, and the US obviously has to US has an obligation there in Taiwan. So in that scenario, have you done some analysis on, like you mentioned, US must have prioritizing the theaters, US must do that. In your view, which is the first priority? You already mentioned Indo-Pacific. What would be the second priority?
I mean, from an American security perspective, maybe free sea lanes would be the
Right.
second priority.
Right.
I don't think the Red Sea mission makes sense. You know, we shouldn't allow terrorist groups or pirates to
Right.
target shipping. Actually, there's a grand tradition here. President Thomas Jefferson in 1803
Yeah.
commissioned 3 large naval ships to be sent to the Mediterranean to fight North African
Yes,
pirates.
absolutely.
So it's actually
It's an old
pretty
tradition.
consistent
Yeah.
with American
Sure.
foreign policy goals to protect free shipping. I think that's probably the second issue.
Yeah. So if that be the case, I think America has to really prioritize what it wants to do going forward. We will come to it in a moment. You are in India. Have you been watching the Indian defense space, or you are looking at something specific? How India is changing its objectives in defense spending, in the defense production? Have you any thoughts on that?
I think India is absolutely on the right track with its Make in India program. Co-production is great, and domestic production is great. It drives down costs. It just makes all the supply chain problems a lot easier to manage. I know India's traditionally focused most of its budget on the army, but over the last couple of years, last decade or so, a lot more spending has been going towards the Navy, and I think that's a really worthwhile project.
That's true. And in a way, US is helping India in the naval space, because India is buying MQ-9Bs. It is also focused on the ISR, for instance, going forward. There is also this new initiative that was taken up by both the governments last year in June, called the ISET, Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. Do you see enough traction between the two ecosystems, defense ecosystems, where co-production can happen in India, and India can then make it here and make it for the world, manufacture for the world? Is that something you've heard?
I definitely think it's something that we should be doing. It's a huge bureaucratic process to get approved, but I would like it to. I think co-production with all Quad members would be a great thing. The Japanese have a lot of industrial capacity. They could be building a lot of these munitions that are so low, which would drive down costs across the board for all of us. With India, I think there is a real space there for that as well. The way people talk about India and Washington now is extremely positive. People see India as a critical partner in the Indo-Pacific and as an integral part of the effort to have a free and fair Indo-Pacific, as we keep saying. In fact, I've heard people say that India is the Indo in Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, I suppose India can take up that responsibility, and I think this relationship has been described as the most consequential in the 21st century by various people. Hopefully, they will work more closely on the military side, the ammunition side, the manufacturing side. But we are about to come up with the completion of 2 years of the Russia-Ukraine war, so I want to have a last word from you on what is your future prediction, if at all. Will this war drag on? It's a war of attrition, or do we see an end point here, really?
Really hard to say. Predicting anything is hard. I think we've heard a lot about Ukraine's munitions problems, that they need more from Western Europe and the United States. But what a lot of people are leaving out is that Ukraine is facing a personnel shortage as well.
I was just going to come to that.
The average age of a Ukrainian soldier, maybe it's new draftees, 43. Yeah, like they're running out of young men who are able to fight.
Right.
And that's going to be a much bigger problem than their munitions problems going forward. It's hard to imagine. I think it will drag on for a while more, the rest of the year at least.
Yes.
But it's hard to imagine it being a years-long process.
Yeah.
I think there is an end in sight. I don't know what that looks like,
That's
but
right. Yeah.
I don't think it'll be the same war.
No, I think you're on the right track, because even the Russians would be wary of dragging it on, despite its revived military-industrial complex. Production rates have gone up as far as munitions are concerned, and of course, but there's also a whole lot of propaganda, a whole lot of misinformation, because I heard at one of the think tank events from someone that Ukraine is very resilient, Ukraine is got 800,000 fighters fighting against Russia. So I was wondering where the number came from. So I'm not
Hard to
very
say.
sure. And actually what you said is right, because that is going to be a bigger problem. Munitions, equipment, platforms can be supplied. Where are you going to get human resource?
And the Russians are so dug in at this point.
Absolutely.
The last couple of Ukrainian offensive is completely
Yeah,
stalled.
yeah.
It's going to be very hard to dislodge them.
That's right. So I think on that little pessimistic note, we'll end this conversation. But thanks for your insights.
Thank you.
And we'll keep remaining engaged with you in the future too, whenever an occasion arises. But thanks for coming in and giving us this perspective.
Thank you very much.
That was Wilson Beaver, policy analyst from Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., giving us overview of where America must concentrate as far as prioritizing theaters are concerned. Of course, we'll have many more such interactions with different experts. Do keep watching Strat News Global, and of course, keep sending us feedback. That's important for us. For the time being, it's goodbye.